Hi, so I'm Gail, and I wanted to talk about Extinction Rebellion's strategy and how we can see it in a really wide ecology of different theories of change, because I think it's really important that we understand how strategy can be thought about from different perspectives. There are lots of perspectives in our movement and people love different aspects to it, and I hope this talk will clarify why lots of different perspectives actually have deep validity in my opinion. So just to say something about current strategy, and it's more from a UK perspective, that we have a strategy stewardship team, that there was a strategy writing process a couple of months ago, and there's been some feedback. So it's actually going to be a relatively ongoing process. There will be the development of a timeline and so on, but obviously at the minute the focus is on September, actions that focus on government and the school strikes, and then into October for the rebellion. But it's good to see it in its widest possible context. Each team's looking at their strategy within that, and I'm not really here to sort of explain in detail the current strategy, but to say more about where strategies can come from. So I want to look at it through a few lenses, one being the pillars that hold the system in place. So that's how Gene Sharp, the father of civil resistance, thought about how you look at a system and try and make a significant change to it, how you take out a dictatorship and so on. Also through purpose and vision and culture, also through the lens of patriarchy and the other aspects of the system that live through our bodies, like white supremacy, and underneath that even consciousness, including something called teal consciousness I want to speak to. So within that there are transformational processes that we're all undertaking, and there are frameworks for actually how things change that I'll speak to, and some of the practices that we're using and why. And it's also useful to think about how do we know if things are working. And I finally want to say something about the deep adaptation agenda, which is Jem Bendel's paper that you may know about. It's the most downloaded academic paper on the climate crisis, climate ecological crisis, 500,000 downloads, and a bit more on this teal consciousness and this really imperfect journey that we're on in Extinction Rebellion together. I guess the first thing to say, and to be clear on how you develop a strategy, you need to be thinking about why are things so fucked, why are they so messed up, and therefore what you're supposed to do about it, and that's where you get your theories of change from. And theories of change have just a few simple elements to them. First of all, you say what issues there are that need tackling, what change you need, how that change gets undertaken, who does it, and how you know you're succeeding. So if we look first about the issues, I think we can see the issues that hold this system in place in four layers actually. So the first layer that many of us are focused on would be that there is a fake democracy. It's not really working for us, this democracy. And actually, the more that people understand that there is an emergency situation, the risk is going in the direction of less democracy, as in fascism, that's already in the room. What XR needs to do is focus on more democracy. And for me and others, this is the key messaging for the October Rebellion. I'll share a personal view right now, which is I can see the October Rebellion focusing very much on a people's coup, if you like, a people's takeover of democracy. If it continues in the UK to be so utterly shambolic and showing itself in literally a state of collapse, obviously you have to think about how you do that in a really good way. This is about bringing more people power behind democracy in more democratic forms. More democracy, not less. We have a very destructive economy and legal system that underpins that globally. I call it capitalism on crack cocaine, it's neoliberalism. But actually the father of neoliberalism, Milton Friedman, speaking highly of it, once said that the free market system would make sure that no power was concentrated and therefore no harm was done. So can you imagine if we did have an actual vision of the economy that had that at the centre rather than economic growth and profit and so on? No power concentrated, no harm done. What a great vision that we could lift up. And the third pillar is the toxic media that we have focused on as well, a media that's not telling the truth and so on. So they're the pillars that hold the system in place. You can talk about systemic, but why are they there in the first place? There are a few people that are really fighting for them, but the majority of us, I reckon, are not behind them. We don't agree with them. We don't think it's a good idea. We've got a sense it's not really working for us. So there's something then about the culture that holds this system in place. It lacks a healthy purpose fundamentally, as I spoke to. What would a healthy purpose be? And then when you put the culture together with the systemic issues, then you come up with the oppressions that run this piece. You come up with white supremacy and the idea that somehow one race is better than all the others. And I think for white people that's such an ocean that we're swimming in that we fail to recognise it because we're so used to it. Underneath these, one could argue, is patriarchy. It's the idea that there was a trauma in humanity several thousand years ago that led to a wound that hasn't been healed, that is felt as scarcity, separation, and powerlessness, that we're separated from each other, from a sense of purpose together, from a feeling that we can make change together. And you have political theorists like Hannah Arendt saying that power lies in the collective. So if we come together, if we stop feeling like we're in competition and that we are connected to nature and we love nature and we want to protect her and so on, that we could then make a shift, that we have to remove the sort of patriarchal system that's in our bodies. And there are initiations that seem to be helping with that, the grieving processes that are happening within XR and the process to reconnect and deal with oppressions and so on. And I would argue underneath that is what we might call the sacred. It might not be the language that works for everybody. It needs to be a language that works for you, whether you're atheist or whatever. So it may feel that it has a spiritual perspective, but I'm essentially talking about love and the consciousness that we're running in our brains. Ultimately, and there seems to be lots of evidence from the science actually, there is a oneness, a connection of energy between us, and that there could be an actual purpose to life itself, that you could see your life, if you had connection to your ancestors and then thinking about the next 7 generations, that your life has an inherent purpose within that flow of life. And to, a capitalist consumerist society is very much wanting to disconnect us from that. Lots of brain sciences suggesting that when we're more in our right brains than our left brains, so look up Ian McGilchrist's work, for example, The Master in His Emissary, that we have a deeper connection to the oneness. There is also a beautiful video by a brain scientist, a TED talk by Jill Bolte-Taylor. We might be able to give some of these links in the bottom. I just want you to think, to recognise, without making a long talk about this, there's another talk in this video channel where I'm talking to Wei Sang, where this is not something you have to sort of believe in and be a hippie around, that there is that possibility, at least. I'm suggesting to be open to it, that love is underneath what really matters to us. So then when we think about how things change, you can look at it in a 2x2 matrix. And I've based this on the work of Micah White. He was a person that was part of the Occupy movement and Adbusters, and has written a book called The End of Protest, a new playbook for revolution. And the way I find this framework really useful, and maybe it's the main thing I want to say today, is I think the only way we're going to make the shift that's necessary is if it's a paradigm shift. We're focused on a political crisis and changing the Overton window, the discussion that humanity's having out there on the streets and so on, but it's going to be a shift in paradigm. And I'm going to talk about consciousness and shifts in consciousness. Again, sounds really hippie, but there's very measurable things around that. So I think this is all possible, but what we need to do is recognise that we're working on different strategic levels. I think that will really help us. So the paradigm shift that we need, I believe it's possible, or I wouldn't be doing this, and I actually believe it's happening. So there are 4 different ways to think about strategy, and if you go along this axis, it's going from something that's more like subjective, that you could be sort of in control of, to the more objective that's happening outside of you, and then from the more material level to the more what you might call esoteric. And again, I'm not talking about wafty woo-woo stuff, I'm just talking about there are aspects that we're not necessarily fully cognizant of, but there is science out there talking in that way. I personally believe that science and spirituality are on their way to unification, but that's a personal view. It's worth mentioning that Wei Sang, in reviewing a lot of revolutionary movements, noted that the things that really help in them are obviously being well organised, and our systems are really helping us with that, and obviously always need improving. It's also about aspects of charisma that come through in our movements, and I think that's really important, how we all show up in our leadership and bring our true selves forwards, and that our hearts and our vulnerability and our love, and I think authenticity, and I think that's what charisma's about for me. And then the other bit is when esoteric religion is somehow behind in the background, that has had an impact on so many changes. It's worth watching his video on that. And I think you could just really be interested in that, even, you know, from an atheist perspective. I mean, from my perspective, I'm interested in teleology, the idea that there may be inherent purpose in the universe. It shows up through things like morphic resonance, which was actually known about in the science that I did, which was the science looking at protein structures and crystallizing protein structures and so on. I'm sorry if I'm throwing a few big words around. They are things that, you know, are mentioned online if you want to find out more about them. So looking at this 4x4 matrix, you can actually map in those issues that I've just talked about into these different sections. So when you look at the section that's about asserting our collective will, the actual technical term for it is called volunteerism. That's when we tackle the pillars of this system. So the pillars, the fake democracy, the destructive economy, the toxic media. So how can we use our collective will to say together we can make this change? That's very much the piece that comes out in XR, and that may be your main focus, and that's where you're sitting. That's totally cool. That is like a big part of what we're doing. There's also then what's called subjectivism, which is the idea that you won't really make these changes at the systems level if we don't change ourselves, if we don't change how the system's showing up in us. And that's really about that patriarchal scarcity, separation and powerlessness. And then there's another piece that gets more esoteric that's called theurgism. It's the idea that there could be divine intervention. Sounds a bit mental, I know, and I also feel as a scientist a bit odd saying that. But I do have a spiritual practice of prayer, and I think you can also talk about it just from the perspective of, you know, how it feels for you, your own consciousness, the better part of yourself, what it means to be in touch with sacredness, what meaning is there in your life, what purpose, how you are feeling a vision being lifted up by this movement. The final quadrant is structuralism. It says that change is inevitable, and that's where I see the piece to do with Jem Bendel's work, which is on the deep adaptation, and that's about the culture. I actually should have done it the other way around, but never mind. That this culture isn't lacking a healthy purpose. So we can look at each one of these through a theory of change, so what change is needed. So if we look at volunteerism, it's the one that's most spoke about. A few points to make on that. It is about mass participation, civil disobedience. So Tim Gee's book on counterpower, for example, talks about the need to raise awareness of an issue or consciousness about an issue, coordinating across movements. That's the movement of movement piece that's been talked about, and the way XR has helped to some extent bringing movements together. It needs confrontation. It can be beautiful and respectful and so on, but it needs that confrontation stage. And the consolidation stage, which for us is the citizens' assembly, saying we want a people-powered decision-making process about what the change actually looks like. We know from Erica Chenoweth's work that we need around 3.4% of the population, it could be less than that, in active participation in the movement, not all getting arrested in that, it could be behind the scenes. Somehow, you know, contributing to crowdfunders or social media sharing or whatever. And we need about 50% of the public to support the issue that we're dealing with. That doesn't need to be supporting XR. They may not like us, but they get that this issue of ecological crisis is real. So that's Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan's work. And as I say, the grand strategy then focuses on the three pillars of the system. That comes from Gene Sharp. And so we can also focus on other aspects of the system, like the economy, but I'll speak to that later. I'd like to also say that there are different types of civil disobedience, 3 action types. There's the mass disruption of capital cities, that's very much focused on the democracy. You can also have distributed actions like people refusing to pay taxes or doing actions in their localities. You could have an action focused on a debt refusal, which I'm very much helping to shape and think about at the minute with others. And it's also really important that we have what are called high sacrifice actions that help build pressure and grow the movement. They're the ones that seem to be more controversial. I mean, some of them can be things like hunger striking. They can be when you take out bits of infrastructure temporarily. And as I say, the controversial, I think in XR we've done a really poor job of having a feedback system and a movement conversation of that. Some of that may be that we haven't shared our theory of change strongly enough, but also I think it is about really the fine detailing of these things. You know, are we putting anybody at risk? I really liked how Mickey Kashtan described thinking about actions when she said it needs to be looking from the perspective of minimizing force, because everything does have a force when you're on the streets disrupting. So minimizing force, maximizing the love and the vision, and with a purpose of justice. And that's a good guideline for whether an action is the right design. So the way we're doing the volunteerism, again, this collective assertion of our will, is through momentum-driven organising and big organising and various tactics, and that's the piece that the communities team have been driving. And so it's also the sort of DNA team that are doing talks and trainings and trying to share where we're coming from, why we're doing what we're doing and the way we're doing it. And very much also obviously the action strategy team that includes actions, media, political, regenerative culture, legal and vision, working together to come up with actions. Again, you know, the extent to which this is bottom up, and I know that that's really what XR Youth are calling for. I don't think we've achieved that yet, and I think that's how things need to shift and change in our decentralised movement. We're figuring this thing out together, right? So how do we know we're succeeding? For some of the other areas I'm going to talk about, I won't have slides on this because we haven't figured out how to look at that. But in these areas, we can have something to say about this. Again, we need this 50% passive support for what we're actually saying, and then about 2 million people in the UK in active support. The first thing I'd say is that we did have an exponential, you know, when it goes like a hockey stick, increase in support for the more tricky actions that we did in April. So when we did the DLR tube action, there was a significant increase in donations, in web sign-ups and in social media. So that those actions speak louder than words to people. That doesn't mean that we can't get actions wrong and we could split movements or really put people off. So we do have to think about them, but just wanted to make that point. So how do we know we're succeeding? Well, you have this spectrum of support and opposition going from active support, people who are in your movement, people who support your movement passively, people who are neutral, passive opposition and active opposition. And our job is to increase active support, increase passive support, and you will get more active opposition. That is starting to happen. And, you know, as Gandhi said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they attack you, and then they win, and the attacks are coming. And let's be robust in the face of that and resilient, you know, and I would say really keep our focus on where we're heading in the light and not to get too caught up in that stuff. I mean, we need to speak to it when we need to, but we're heading in a direction, and I personally think that life and history is on our side. So here's a graph that you'll see on the slides, which shows concern about the environment being at the highest levels on record, and it spiked after the Extinction Rebellion protests in London. It was already going up in autumn. The other earlier spike in 2014 is when the flooding happened. And so our job is to keep that going up. So as I said, it's not that people need to like us, it's that they're talking about the issues. And only some people will get involved. So the next slide, relatively complicated slide, but it's basically talking about the support for XR direct action. The thing that matters is the green band. It's people who are strongly in support of action, and that increasing. And interestingly, now this is Ben Kenwood's research from Oxford, that it generalises to over 2 million people. So it could be that we've already got, this is a sample, so it's not clear that the sample size is big enough, but in principle, we're heading in the right direction. The next slide is showing the same, that people are much more willing to take part in these more disruptive actions. So moving back into theories of change and looking at subjectivism, this is a bit about how do we change ourselves. This system is in us. And so really we're talking about ways of tackling the patriarchal wounds. I just want to say how important it is that we're looking at ourselves, in what we're bringing forwards. And I just want to reassure you, as somebody who gets to speak on behalf of XR quite a bit, that I'm in regular processes and circles and therapies for the things that are coming up for me. And I really love Valerie Cower's TED Talk on 3 principles of revolutionary change, and she talks about radical self-love that other movements didn't do, and I think that is something that we really have to bring forwards, and that will show up as self-care. I think it's part of the Rising Feminine, that's how she talks about it. It's the work that we do on decolonisation, on anti-oppression and liberation. And in all honesty, there's been a big debate inside about how that gets done, and that might be why you haven't seen as much of it, but it has been held, and there is more to come. So these are things that are coming through from the Regenerative Culture team, XR Together, and also there's the XR Internationalist Solidarity Network in the UK doing great work as well. The way Miki Kashtan, who's been doing lots of coaching behind the scenes with the Nonviolent Global Leadership Network that's international for XR, the way she talks about healing patriarchal wounds is that we really have to bring forward a vulnerability. And the way I've understood that is sometimes when things are coming at you, when somebody's feeling something, are you able to absorb? Not always you can, but are you able to, especially if you're in if you're like a perpetrator role, that other person's feeling something. I know we have this no calling out rule, and sometimes people need to say how it is for them, and can we just listen, as white people, as men, whatever. Bring in vulnerability and tenderness, tenderness for each other, because it's a mess. It's a mess between us, and within that mourning for what we've lost and we will continue to lose, that is part of what we're going to have to do together. So to speak to theurgism, this idea that there can be an intention towards a paradigm shift, this is about very much holding a vision of change, right? So it's really worth, again, watching Jane Morton's video on emergency mode messaging. Again, you can look her up, Jane Mode, emergency mode messaging in YouTube. And what she says is that we need to message in a way that says, so Roger's original paper was tell the truth and ask people to act according to their values. There's actually a missing piece in that, which is hold a vision that change is possible. And that's super important right now that we do that. It's probably the most important thing, right? The truth telling is absolutely crucial, and there's the many truths but of these times. But there's something in emergency mode that people respond to emergency mode. They actually respond to it. It's well documented, and it's something that the Green Movement missed not doing this. And we may have been persuaded not to by those that wanted us to fail. So the vision that we're suggesting and sharing within Extinction Rebellion, and it's a process to have a dialogue about this, right, but is one that says we are moving in the direction of more democracy, not less, not towards the fascism, towards more togetherness, and that we know that we're going to face losses, but we can do it through our communities, that we need less, and that actually it's now the time for humanity to stop harming and start repairing. stop harming and start repairing, and do that together with more democracy and all the pieces that we do in that way. And that's a vision that is universally known about, like for the Jewish faith, it's Tikkun Olam. In Africa, it's talked about as Ubuntu, and there's been lots of ways the vision sensing team led by Skeena Rathor can bring that through in multiple of languages and cultural relevant ways, as in by asking people from different cultures to write that how they feel it. There is something more mystical that happens behind the scenes, which is that people hold prayers, and again, scientifically you can think about it as potentially that there is an inherent purpose in the universe, and it doesn't matter if there isn't. If there is, it's worth having a go, isn't it? Right, that's how I see it. So it's about asking for help, and it maybe just helps with a different bit of your brain. There's some great science of neuroplasticity, for example. So if you do a ritual or some ceremony or something like that, it follows the stages of it follows the same stages that neuroplasticity science says you should do if you want to change your brain. So this idea that you would say, like, I'm intending for this action to go really well, set a group intention together and really ask for help for that. It may be doing something in here, it may be doing something wider, who knows, I want to just speak very briefly to something controversial. I've been speaking about psychedelic medicines. They're not for everybody. They've been part of my path, and they very much speak to me in terms of access to these processes. They need to be used in really safe and healthy ways if anybody is using them. There's lots of information out there on reset.me. They are not, XR doesn't have a position on them, but there's lots of science regarding their use and how people become more nature connected as a result. And there is also a deep indigenous tradition on them, that it's part of people's spiritual practice, and that it's an assault on freedom not to be able to do those practices. So that's why I've spoken to it, and it's because I think it's so central to this theory of change for many of us and for healing of trauma. But I really understand that when that's out there, people feel worried that can be movement splitting and is disturbing, and sounds like we're telling everybody to take loads of drugs and whatever. Bear in mind, caffeine's a drug, sugar's a drug, alcohol's a drug. Capitalism has no problem with it. Somehow it has a problem with these. Let's wonder why that is, Anyway, there's something here about meaning of our own lives, about our own hero's journey. It's called the monomyth. That context that we have in our lives between our ancestors and those that come after us, and what our process is here. And my experience, and I've heard this from others, is that when we do this grief work of facing these times, that our hearts break open, that there's more love, and that there's therefore more courage, and the purpose-led life comes forwards. And it's such a joy, actually, and there are cycles with the grief. But I just think that that's a super important journey for each of us. Some of the initiation in XR is, I believe, the collective grieving. Daniel Pinchbeck spoke about that in a book, about how that would lift a transition in human consciousness. And I think I see that happening. It can also be the initiation of what it means to be arrested by those for whom that is an appropriate action. There's something about unhooking yourself from this system, either by arrest or by really supporting that process for other people, that says we disobey this system because it's fucking us over, right? And then the move towards teal consciousness and connection to oneness, to, and it is in the physics, basically, this idea that whether if you're looking at M theory, I'm not up on all the latest physics, but I think there is potentially a physical basis for some of this stuff. So I'm showing a slide on this stuff I keep mentioning about teal consciousness, which is from a system called spiral dynamics. It's actually something politicians use, and it's been mapped against business types. So it's not like some woo-woo hippie thing again. So without going into it in great detail, there's that. We can be running many layers of this consciousness throughout a given day. So the base layer is like, I'm hungry, I need to sleep. It's like what babies do. I'm cold. Meeting those really basic instinctive needs, and that each of other layers, and they give colours to these layers, have checked in online in humanity at different stages. So, for example, there's a very tribal layer, which is called the red layer, which is quite aggressive, it can be courageous, impulsive and so on. And I know when I'm watching my kids play football or their Team Forest Green, I'm in that mode, you know. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. But sometimes we can be, you know, there's a green layer, that's the layer that's a lot of us are in, which is the sort of progressive left. It can have a red shadow where we actually sit in quite shaming judgment of each other, because it actually gets quite tribal. It's them, and there's something about going, actually this is about humanity, and that isn't about not, you know, we do need to point to behaviours that aren't okay, but also we can recognise that there are values in other layers that do speak to us, you know, the more traditional amber layer, I've heard it called blue in other, blue as well, but that is more the socially conservative layer. It tends to be about sort of role, faith in roles and discipline, and maybe it gets a bit more nationalistic and rules and order, and it's socially conservative, and it's how we can hold that value within our in our movement, you know, that's not, you know, as a parent I recognise and value some of those values that sit in that layer without wanting that to run the world. I think there has to be more that comes through. There's an orange layer that's about the science, you know, for some people, if things aren't absolutely baked in science, they just don't want to speak about it, and that's cool if that's but it is a perspective. There are other ways of thinking. Now, I talk about the emergence of the teal layer and the turquoise layer right now. And as I say, you can ask people questions on a questionnaire to figure out what bits people are holding. And I hope none of this sounds bloody arrogant or superior, that I'm talking about consciousness levels, but it's a thing that I think is really interesting. I just want to speak to Frederick Laloux's work. He's written a book called Reinventing Organisations, and it's businesses that have come out into teal layer. And what the teal layer does is it's about purpose, not about profit. Businesses might make profit, but they get behind purpose. And he gives some great examples, and he gives examples of businesses sitting in the other layers, by the way, but you watch a YouTube video from him, Frederick Laloux. But what happens when businesses are in teal is that they are also self-managing, so that a lot more there's a lot less hierarchy and a lot more self-organising systems, and that people can bring vulnerability into their workspace. And there have been businesses that are so in their purpose. One example of a community nursing organisation in the Netherlands that got 80% market share, and they actually went and taught their competitors how to be more like them for free, because they wanted everybody to have that shared purpose and that shared way of working. And so wouldn't it be amazing if the business world continues to move in that direction and actually hold this purpose that our culture needs to speak to, that we want to stop harm and start repairing harm and help us get that done together. So how I see Extinction Rebellion is that we are trying to be a teal organising network, and as it's going global, that's massively challenging, and it's never been done before that I'm aware of. So what a challenge, but what a thing to recognise that this is an emergent thing that's coming, and how can we lift that up? How can we be behind that and recognise that that's what's happening? So the final quadrant to talk about is structuralism, the idea that change is inevitable, and it's going to come from the fact that, you know, fossil fuel companies and lots of pension companies and so on are invested in what's called stranded assets. So it's like things that have to stop and have to not happen. That there's going to be economic pressure as the temperature goes up. It causes collapse in the economy, food shortages. You know, it's pretty much seen as inevitable that there'll be a collapse, not by everybody, but credible commentators are saying that. So it's important that as much as possible we keep pointing culturally to this awakening, to this truth of these times, that we're in such a bad way and we're ready for a big shift. And so things like cultures declares and doctors declares and lawyers declares and all that, musicians declares, is an important part of the work that XR is doing. It's an important part of the strategy, and welcoming people are holding that. I think that within understanding that the economy is going to collapse, that we can then start to talk about that as a systemic issue. And a piece of work that I'm doing with others is the possibility of holding some international demands, and this wouldn't be that everybody has to sign up to them, because it would just be whoever's interested. I just want to share this as a vision. You know, the idea that we say internationally, international bodies, financiers, hedge funds, OECD, World Bank, all that business, tell the truth. The reason why humanity is in an utter crisis is because the operating system we're running, politically, culturally, legally, economically, is not the right one. It doesn't work for us. It's killing life on Earth. I would love to see us ask for the law of ecocide as an immediate way that we can stop and repair harm. Because I'm not going to say more about that, but it's Polly Higgins' law, and it would be at the UN Rome Statute level. And as well as holding people criminally to account for mass damage and destruction, it also insists that people who suffer from the front lines of the ecological crisis are looked after. The reparations agenda. And that wouldn't it be amazing to have an international citizens' assembly and what you'd call a multi-stakeholder panel, so some of the expertise needing to come together to rewire humanity. You know, so again, it needs to be from that teal consciousness that's not in opposition, we're not having a fight, we're having a grown-up conversation to say this isn't working for us, what do we need to do differently? And the way I think we lift that up is through a mass debt refusal. This has been drafted in a strategy, and I don't know where it's got to, and I'm working on it as a possibility. I think it's going to come myself, but obviously these things come in not just because somebody goes, we're doing this thing, it's who wants to join in, isn't it? But literally, why are we paying debts to a system that's killing us, in my view? So I guess the final thing I want to speak to is that deep adaptation, the teal consciousness piece, is that what are we doing in XR that is going to support us as things get worse, frankly. And the way I would say it is that the work we're doing is prefigurative. It is anti-fascist. It's holding a vision that we need to be in the direction of more democracy. It's the People's Assembly's work. It's the way we're learning how to, through well-facilitated meetings, work together. It's how we're holding conflict. It's how we're working on diversity. It's how we're bringing forward our vulnerability. It's how we address patriarchy and white supremacy. And goodness, I know we're not getting that right, you know, but like intention, let's keep doing our best and moving on that stuff. It's how we centre the youth in our movement. It's how we really notice that there's an evolutionary purpose here. So this is what you might call prefigurative. It's the piece that will help us to be together as things go pear-shaped, and that's why it's so important. It's very imperfect, our journey in Extinction Rebellion. I'm just briefly showing a slide of all these different circles that work together to help an action come together. But and then I'm just showing a slide here that turned up in Marble Arch from Banksy. Isn't it wonderful when the artists come forwards? Because he says, from this moment, despair ends and tactics begin. You know, speaking to that shift that's happening and being able to lift up a vision. That's how I feel that. So on this final slide, just to breathe, because there's a lot of information that I've shared. I was talking about this imperfect journey that we're on, and I really love this piece from Adrienne Mari Brown, who wrote a book called Emergent Strategy that again shaped some of the thinking in Extinction Rebellion. And I think there's something here about what we can deeply trust. She says, trust the people who move towards you and already feel like home. Trust the people to let you rest. Trust the people to do everything better than you could have imagined. Trust the people and they become trustworthy. Trust the people who let children teach, remind us how to emote, be still and laugh. Trust the people are doing their work to trust themselves. Trust that each breach of trust can deepen trust or clarify boundaries. Trust the people who revel in pleasure after hard work. Trust the people who see and hold your heart. Trust the people who listen to wails. Trust the people and you will become trustworthy. Trust the people and show them your love. Trust the people. And I've got a picture of a fire there because the way I really feel that is that, you know, in my tradition, which is more pagan, is it's seen there's the element of transformation, and it's a leap of faith, you know, to step into a fire together. And I'm talking about all these different ways in which we're trying to hold a vision for XR and run strategy on different layers and be part of that together. And I think it's about us trusting each other, walking into this fire. We might get a little bit singed around the edges as part of it, or, you know, even worse at times, but we'll be transformed through it. And let's trust each other and love each other through that, and go for it, especially this October, because the time is now. Lots of love.